It is my privilege now to call upon Leslie Maitland, our Amram Scholar Series chair, but also in her own right, a Holocaust author who wrote Crossing the Borders of Time. And Leslie has presented her book in this very setting itself, and we are so grateful for all that she does and for her getting us our speaker this evening. Leslie?
Thank you, Rabbi Lustig, and thank all of you for participating in this commemoration of Kristallnacht, the night 81 years ago when the Nazis unleashed unprecedented terror and destruction throughout Germany. Joined by unrestrained mobs, stormtroopers not only set upon Jewish shops and homes and synagogues, but also attacked and murdered Jews on the streets. They filled concentration camps with about 30,000 others, roughly 10% of the Jews still left in the country. Among them was my grandfather's brother, Heinrich, then 60 years old, arrested that night on grounds of being a Jew. He had been born and was living in Freiburg in the southwest corner of Germany near the French border. Imprisoned with 10,000 other Jewish men at Dachau near Munich, he was released a month later with a warning to get out of the country. Hitler's goal of purging Jews from Germany and German-held lands began with forced emigration. Traumatized and severely injured, Heinrich nonetheless proved one of the lucky ones. Having sent his 2 sons to New York a few years earlier, he succeeded in gaining entry to the United States. But my mother's family, who had managed to cross the border to France just 3 months before Kristallnacht, would spend the next 4 years on the run, fruitlessly struggling to gain visas to this country. Meanwhile, the Nazis devised a new solution to their Jewish problem, no longer forced emigration, but extermination, not only in Germany, but throughout Europe. Just a half an hour north of Freiburg is the town of Kippenheim, the fate of whose Jews became the subject of intense fascination and deep research for tonight's speaker, Michael Dobbs, author of The Unwanted, America, Auschwitz, and A Village Caught in Between. A former foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, he worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he drew on previously unpublished letters, diaries, and visa records to paint a vivid picture of what it was like to live among increasingly hostile neighbors while waiting for the piece of paper with a stamp that would determine their fate. He describes the mass expulsion of these unwanted German Jews to France in 1940, their continuing quest for American visas, and he recounts the heated debate taking place in the United States over whether or not to admit refugees amid growing isolationism, xenophobia, and fears about so-called enemy aliens secretly gaining entry to this country. The result is a page-turning narrative filled with memorable characters facing life or death moments that resonate today, as the plight of desperate refugees is often obscured by political rhetoric and angry division over immigration. Lauding Mr. Dobbs's historical account in a review, the New York Times emphasized how it echoes politics today and warned that it provides a glimpse of how we may be judged by future generations. The author of 5 previous books, Mr. Dobbs was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. As the son of diplomats, he spent much of his youth in the Soviet Union, and as a journalist, he went on to cover the collapse of communism. He reported from Rome, Africa, Yugoslavia, and Poland, and covered the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, the Gorbachev-Reagan summits, and the Tiananmen Square uprising in China. In 2007, he launched the Post's fact-checker column, handing out Pinocchios to lying politicians. Since retiring from the Post after the 2008 election, he has taught courses at Princeton, Michigan, Georgetown, and American universities, and has served on the staff of the Holocaust Museum. His talk tonight is presented in cooperation with the Jewish Book Council. I'm honored to present Michael Dobbs, who will be signing books following tonight's service. Thank you.
And while we invite Michael Dobbs to come forward, we're going to have a technical interlude. The PowerPoint is coming in. and it's going to be right up front, and if you need to adjust yourself, you can. Are we going up? Yes. Careful, gentlemen. Excellent. If you guys want to join in the front so you can see.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you very much, Leslie. So I want to talk about my book, The Unwanted, which came out a few months ago and grew out of my research for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Perhaps some of you have seen the exhibit there, Americans and the Holocaust, which looks at America's response to the rise of Nazism in the 30s. And of course, part of that response was the question of immigration policy. What did we do? How did we respond to the refugee crisis that resulted from the rise of Hitler? The title of the book, The Unwanted, comes from the slogan that was plastered over the walls of every German village and town during the Nazi period: Jews are unwanted here. And the question that interested me was, of course, we know that the Jews were unwanted in Germany, but were they wanted anywhere else? Because particularly after Kristallnacht, which was the decisive moment when harassment and persecution of Jews turned to physical violence, particularly after Kristallnacht, everybody understood, all the German Jews understood that they had to get out of Germany by one means or another. And the place that they looked to, for the most part, was America. Immigration to Palestine had become very difficult in the late 30s, and for all its problems, the United States was the country that was still accepting most German Jews. So I was interested in this question of what happened to the people who didn't make it. What were the reasons why they were unable to make it to America? And in many cases, it boiled down to whether you were able to receive a piece, what an American journalist called Dorothy Thompson called a piece of paper with a stamp on it that meant the difference between life and death. If you've been to our exhibit at the museum, you'll see we have a wall of paper, of different types of paper that you had to obtain in order to get out of Nazi Germany and get to a country of refuge like the United States. You had to get exit visas. You had to get exit visas. You had to get pieces of paper from the customs. You had to get transit visas. You had to show that you'd paid all your taxes. And you had to get permission to enter the United States. And without one single piece of those, one single piece of paper with a stamp on it, you ended up probably in a place like Auschwitz. So I wanted to understand the process by which these pieces of paper were issued and how difficult it was to obtain them. And in the end, that meant looking at US immigration policy during the 30s under FDR. There have been quite a few books written about this subject, but all the books, or practically all the books that I'm aware of, have been written from the Washington perspective. this bureaucratic political struggle that was taking place here in Washington between people who wanted to let more refugees in and people who wanted to keep them out. And some of these books have been very harshly critical of Roosevelt, and some have been more sympathetic. But I wanted to tell that story. I mean, that's one of the stories in the book, but I wanted to combine it with the story of, from the perspective of some of the people who were trying to reach America, the unwanted. And I ended up choosing a village on the edge of the Black Forest called Kippenheim, just across the Rhine River from Alsace. It's a village of about 1,500 people. It had about 1,500 people then. It still has about 1,500 people. A mixed Christian, Jewish population. Actually, Jews were only about 12-13% of the population. In this photograph, you can see the church on the left, the rat house in the middle, and on the right, you can see the synagogue. Jews had been living in Kippenheim for more than 300 years, through good times and bad. During the First World War, many had fought, or practically all of them had fought, for the German army. A number had been killed in what was called the Great War. So they thought of themselves as loyal German citizens. German Jews, as you probably know, were very assimilated into German society. Of course, all that changed after Hitler came to power in 1933, and it changed even more after Kristallnacht. Actually, I begin my book at Kristallnacht. I begin with the very everyday story of a Jewish girl named Heidi Wackenheimer, aged 14, going to high school. She rode on her bicycle to high school in the neighboring town of Ettenheim, because Kippenheim was too small to have a high school. And she gets to the school, and suddenly the principal turns on her and says, "Get out, you filthy Jew." She goes back home to the village, and her father has been arrested, rounded up with all the other Jewish men of the village and the surrounding villagers, and they're herded off to camps. The Kippenheimers are taken to Dachau, where they're unspeakable tortures. Now, this is actually a photograph from the Kippenheim synagogue that came to earth many years later of the destruction at Kristallnacht. In the sanctuary there, you can see 3 members of the Hitler Youth. They have axes over their shoulders. They've just finished smashing up the sanctuary. And there are a couple of small boys on the left who are looking for crystal in the wreckage of the synagogue. So for German Jews, for the Jews from Kippenheim, this was the turning point. They all understood that they had to get out of Germany. And for the most part, they'd all applied for visas to come to the United States from the local US consulate in Stuttgart. Now, I'm often asked why I chose Kippenheim, and part of the reason, actually one of the main reasons, is that we have photographs of a deportation that took place a couple of years later, in October 1940, not to the east, but to the west. I hadn't understood this before I started doing the research, but before the deportations to the east, there was an attempt at what we would call ethnic cleansing and making this part of Germany Judenrein, or Jewish, free of Jews. And one of the communities that was cleansed of Jews was Kippenheim. And we actually have photographs of this deportation. And because Kippenheim's a small place, we know the people in the photographs. We are able to, in this photograph, for example, this is the cigarette distributor. His name is Max Walfer, and his wife Fanny. They're being put on a truck to be taken to the local railway station, and then to be taken, as Leslie's relatives were, to Gers in France, a camp that was set up actually to receive Spanish refugees, but then the when the 6,500 Jews from Baden were deported to France, the French put them in a camp called Gers. Now, when I saw these photographs, there are 5 or 6 of them, I wanted to find out what happened to the people in the photograph, because I knew that they all wanted to come to America and they'd applied for US visas. Did they make it or didn't they make it? So, in the case of the Valfas, we not only have these photographs, but I was able also to find correspondence with their children and their relatives. And they describe what it was like to be deported from their hometown. Fanny Valfa writes from Gers, "I packed so much of it in 2 hours, so much luggage, but most of it the Herren, which was their code word for the Gestapo, threw back into the house. No linen, no clothes, none of the things your dear Papa and I have acquired over the years. We have become beggars. I still cannot grasp that we have become so poor and helpless. My eyes hurt from crying." That's Fanny in December 1940. And she urges her children to go to the Jewish committees, somewhere in the UK, somewhere in the US, and try to help us from the mess that we're in. Now, what is interesting to me when I researched the book was the connection between the Valfa story and what was happening in the United States. Because at every turn, when they tried to obtain their visas, something would happen in the United States that made it much more difficult. A few months before they were deported to France, France itself had fallen. And the explanation that was given for the fall of France was that fifth columnists must be operating behind enemy lines. And the United States was swept by what became known as the fifth column fever. Everybody was reporting, if you spoke German in the street, you were reported to the FBI. And this affected the refugees, or people trying to reach America. It was rather like, what happened after 9/11, that extra checks were imposed. So people like Max and Fanny Valfa had to start the immigration process all over again. And then, finally, it looked as though they were about to obtain their visas. They were summoned from Gers to Marseille, where there was a US consulate, and they were given an appointment for December the 8th, 1941. The day before, of course, the US fleet was bombed at Pearl Harbor. The US enters the war against Germany, and suddenly these German Jews all overnight become what's known as enemy aliens. And there had to be more checks. There was a committee set up in Washington from different departments of the US government that had to screen every single visa application of German Jews, or Jews from any country, not just Germany. And so they had to start all over again. And by the time they got through this, they had a son in Chicago who helped them, and he writes to them in the summer of 1942, in July 1942. He thinks they've finally got their visa. "I see you, my dears, trying to keep the tears from your cheeks," he writes. "Keep your heads high. God willing, you will soon be able to set foot in this wonderful country." This is Karl Valfa to his parents. But in the middle of 1942, that's precisely the moment that Leslie talked about, when German policy turned from forced immigration to extermination. And instead of being allowed to emigrate to America, they were put on trains and ended up in Auschwitz in August 1942. Now I'm just simplifying the story here because I'm only choosing 2 families, but I describe more in the book. This is the Valfa family who live just round the corner, and they're also being escorted out of their house. They've had to shut the shutters, leave the key in the door, and they're also being loaded onto this truck. The neighbors are watching, some are sort of hiding behind the windows, you can see in some of the photographs. And they're also taken to Gers. But they're slightly ahead of the Valfas in line for US visas. They've applied a few weeks before, so their numbers are called a few weeks before. they get to the US consulate in Marseille a few weeks before the Valfas. And those few weeks make all the difference. When I was researching the book, I was trying to find out what happened to the people I saw in the photographs. So of course, the main research tool, or one of the main research tools for a journalist is Google. I plugged in the Valfa family, this is the Meyer family, sorry. I plugged in Kurt Meyer into Google, and out popped the result that he was a cataloger of German books at the Library of Congress here in DC, just 5 minutes down the mall by cab from the US Holocaust Museum. So I went to see Kurt, and he explained to me, he told me his family's story, and he talked about, you can see him in the photograph there, and you can see him decades later, aged 87, he's now 89. He goes back to Germany every year and gives talks to churches and schools, and a couple of years ago he invited me to go with him. And he always ends up his talk by showing a photograph of his American visa. And he tells his audiences, if you're missing just one stamp, you could die. This was the most precious document I ever possessed. These stamps saved our lives. This is a photograph of Kurt Meyer in Germany many years later, after his life was saved by an American, by being able to obtain what Dorothy Thompson called the piece of paper with a stamp on it. Just end by showing you the Kippenheim synagogue. It was actually not destroyed at Kristallnacht because not all synagogues were burned down at Kristallnacht. If there was a Christian houses adjacent to the synagogue that could have been destroyed by burning down the synagogue usually survived, although it was trashed. It was turned into an agricultural warehouse, and many years later, local German historians started asking questions about the Jewish community, and there was also a push from abroad to restore the synagogue. So there you see the synagogue that was destroyed or partially destroyed at Kristallnacht, and the synagogue as it stands today. Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely to be here. Thank you.